and welcome to our webinar today on engaging frontline civic leaders in response to COVID-19. We're really glad that you could join us, and we're really glad that you are with us on such an important topic today. So important that we had over 330 people register for this webinar. Let me just set up some ideas, and then we'll jump into what we want to talk about today. You know, we face, as you know, multiple crises in our country today. As best I can count, there are 4 of them. We face a global pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen in over 100 years. We face an economic crisis, an economic tumult. We face the crystallization of racism that has been with this country since before its founding. And in many respects, we face a political crisis made up of gridlock and acrimony and an inability to often get things done. At the Institute, we wanted to engage our network and people beyond our network, all across 50 states and then into some other countries, to talk about their response to COVID-19, how they're dealing with it, how they're addressing it, their fears about it, and the economic and political crises surrounding it. And as I go through some of the findings today, you'll hear echoes also of the debates we're now having in terms of anti-racism as well. Let me just say that I believe that the work that each of you is doing, the work that the Institute is doing, is more important than ever. No matter what we do at the national level, and make no mistake, we need action at the national level on a whole array of issues before us. No matter what action gets taken ultimately at the national level, the challenges we face will come back to our local communities, because it's in our local communities that we will need to see and hear one another. It's in our local communities that we will need to afford one another dignity. It's in our local communities in which we have to forge the relationships to address many of the challenges that require us to take action. It's in our local communities and in our daily lives where our own mindsets and behaviors and actions need to fundamentally shift to address so many of the issues that I'm going to talk in a few minutes about today. And as you know, it's in our local communities where we will fuel the kind of shifts that we need, indeed, I would say the kind of transformation that this country is yearning for and in so many ways calling for today. This is not a moment. Some people say this is a special moment. I actually believe it is a transformational period in American history, the likes of which we saw after the Civil War and Reconstruction, the likes of which we saw after civil rights in the 1960s. This is a major turning point potentially in the course of our nation. And so we sent out a questionnaire in May and June of this year, as you know, and we asked 4 basic questions in a typical Harwood Institute way. What are you wrestling with in responding to this crisis? What do you believe the role of your organization is? What contribution can it make, and who else do you need to be working with in your local communities? What fears do you hold about how your community might respond to this crisis or now crises? And what aspirations do you have about how your community can emerge from these crises in a stronger position than when we went in? Over 330 people from across 34 states in Washington, D.C. responded. We had a really good split. 40% came from urban communities, about 35% from suburban communities, and 27% from rural communities. So we had a good rural representation. We had over 20% people of color. And these frontline civic leaders represented libraries and schools and school districts, community foundations, United Ways, local businesses, arts groups, and an assortment of other groups. So we had a really nice spread of what of what's happening in local communities. And so in the next few minutes, I'd like to review the main findings that we heard. I'd like to bring on two panelists who are joining us today. Beth Jones from the Greater Clark Foundation, who I'll introduce more in a few minutes, and Bon Gordon from the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation. We'd like to have a discussion with them, then a discussion with you, and then leave you with some, what I believe are some implications for how we move forward and some next steps and important things that you can do with the Institute moving forward. If you're just joining us, I'm Rich Harwood. I'm president of the Harwood Institute for Public Innovation. We're here to talk about the response of frontline civic leaders to the COVID-19 crisis and how people are responding in communities across the country, and we're really glad that you're joining us. Max, if you could throw up the first slide here. There are, here we go. There are three overall messages that I want to just touch on quickly as we move through this. The first one is this: how do we make sure that we do not blow the opportunity before us? We are going through major tumult in our country. There are so many issues, as I'll speak about in a moment, that are coming to the fore. So many things that are being laid bare in our nation. How do we seize this time, this opportunity, and really propel our nation forward and make a more perfect union and get closer, ever closer to fulfilling the promise of America? Second, what we're finding is that communities are demonstrating a renewed ability to come together, which for me at least provides a deep sense of hope and a deep sense of possibility about what we're capable of and the innate capacities that each of us has individually and that we hold collectively. And then third, I think this period is a call for a new civic awakening in America, a time where we choose to see and hear all people, not just some of us, and where we choose to show up in fundamentally different ways about how we work together and how we come to believe in America again together. And so I think these three overall messages are really important, coming out of what we learned from these 330 people who responded, or 300 plus responded to this questionnaire from 34 states and the District of Columbia. So let me go to about a half dozen key findings, key themes that we found from this questionnaire. I don't think they'll be surprising to you, but I do think they are vital and important for us to hear. And importantly, I think they're vital and important for us to heed. And I think they're vital and important for us to take action on. The first one that people told us about is that the current crisis has laid bare deep and profound disparities and challenges that communities must tackle now. This came through loud and clear in the 300 plus responses that we heard. That the COVID-19 response, the economic tumult that we're experiencing now, this racial anti-racism, call for anti-racism in our country, has laid bare the poverty that exists in our country. It has laid bare the deep threads of and strains of racism that have plagued our country for so long. It has laid bare the challenges of access to services among different groups and people in our society. As you know, COVID-19 has hit communities of color disproportionately. It has hit low-income communities disproportionately. It is now hitting rural communities. And there are people who have limited access to healthcare, people who have limited access to mental health services, people who have limited access to drug addiction services when they need them most. We're seeing suicides go up. And as you know, while so many kids are out of school and so many kids are now getting ready to return to school, not everyone has access to connectivity and other types of resources that will enable them to learn from home if that's in fact where they need to learn from moving forward. So that's the first finding. The second is that physical health and safety is a constant preoccupation for the civic leaders we talked with, and they fear deeply that these aren't being taken seriously. So many groups that we talked to, I know there are libraries on this call, so many libraries, for instance, that we talked to spoke about their fears of reopening and whether or not people, Americans, their fellow Americans, people who live in their communities, will wear face masks, whether or not people will engage in social distancing. Over and over again, we heard these concerns about what to do. People from the groups that responded to this questionnaire said that they're worried about the health and safety, not only of those they serve, but the people who serve on their staffs. And so they're looking for leadership in our country to engage people around taking seriously the physical health and safety warnings and precautions that we're being asked to take. And I think what people are saying loud and clear is that much of that leadership may not come from our national leaders, but will have to come from our state and local leaders, including themselves. Third, the negative economic impact of COVID-19 is being felt deeply by community organizations and jeopardizes their ability to respond. You all know this. I'm sure many of you are experiencing this directly. I know many of the partners that we're working with are experiencing this. I know that one of the library partners we have in California had to, at one point, reduce their staff to all but 3 people. There is this funding crisis that so many of the groups that we talk to who work in frontline civic organizations that we talk to are experiencing. And there is a real tension between serving the community and finding ways to survive as an organization. And I don't think any of you will be surprised when you hear me say that I think a key to survival will be our ability in smart ways, in strategic ways, to turn outward toward our communities, to turn outward toward our partners, and to figure out how we can work in ways that are more relevant, even more relevant and significant and impactful to communities as we move forward. And I hope we'll be able to talk about that together in this webinar. The fourth finding is that communities are working in new ways that demonstrate our innate capacities to get things done. This, to me, is something that the Institute has been calling for years, and it is happening now. We are forming in so many ways, notwithstanding the challenges that we face, or probably because of the challenges that we face. We are building stronger ties between and among us. There is a growing interconnectedness in many ways. There's a greater sense of empathy and compassion that seems to be emerging in many respects. And that frontline civic leaders told us that their organizations are beginning to work with other partners, as I was just suggesting a few moments ago. They're beginning to work with other partners in new ways, in ways that are unexpected, in ways that maybe they couldn't have imagined before, and in combinations they definitely could not have imagined before. We're seeing this in ways in which libraries are working with schools in new ways. Public broadcasting is working with community health organizations. We're seeing this in ways in which communities are coming together to begin real deep and meaningful discussions, and hopefully lasting discussions about race and anti-racism. We'll talk more about this with our 2 guests in a few moments. But what's important here is that we are demonstrating that we have innate capacities that we can tap, that too often we leave on the table and never find ways to engage with, never, in some cases, make even visible in our communities. And they are becoming more visible to us. We are recognizing them and tapping into them. Fifth, many civic leaders fear, notwithstanding the innate capacities that we're tapping, many civic leaders fear that we will go back to usual and we will come out weaker from what we're facing. They look at past disasters that we have faced and recognize that once we get past the initial response period, we failed to recover in new ways and to rebuild in new ways. They talk about underlying conditions that have been bubbling up for years, really decades in our country, in terms of anger and animosity, political polarization, these deep societal disparities that I talked about a few moments ago, the lack of leadership at a national level and sometimes at a community level, and weakened community organizations. And they fear that if we do not seize this opportunity, if we do not change the way in which we operate, if we do not actually tap our innate capabilities in new ways, that we will come out weaker from these crises than we even were before they began. It is a deep and abiding fear and an enduring fear among the people we talk to. And then lastly, and I'll end here, while business as usual will not work moving forward, and this is important for those of us on this call today, there is a lack of a shared agreement about how to move forward. There is a felt need, what the Institute would call a felt need, that we need a different way to move forward, a different way to see and hear one another, a different way to afford one another dignity, a different way to make community a common enterprise. But it is less clear among the people we talked with about how we make that happen, about how we do that. And so while there may be a deep yearning to get on a more hopeful, inclusive, equitable, and fair path, there is a lack of clarity about how exactly we make that happen. And so, thanks, Max. Let me bring in our two panelists now who we've invited to talk with us about some of these issues. Hopefully their pictures will appear on our screen. There's one person, there's the other. Great. So let me introduce, good to see you guys. Let me introduce our two panelists. Beth Willett Jones is a program officer at the Greater Clark Foundation. The Harwood Institute, has been partnering with the Greater Clark Foundation from Winchester and Clark County, Kentucky. I think that's for the last 3 years or so, catalyzing the community to move forward. Now Beth is working with about 60 organizations in Clark County in response to COVID-19 and the larger systemic changes that are needed there. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Good. Vaughn Gordon, who is from Jackson, Mississippi, but is coming in, I believe, from White County, Tennessee. Right, Vaughn, who has taken time out from a few days off, which we really appreciate, to join us. Very grateful. Is the Youth Engagement Manager for the William Winter Institute for Racial Reconciliation. The Institute just launched a new initiative in Jackson, Mississippi to deal with the fault lines in that community, as in many communities, and to help generate a stronger can-do narrative and spirit. Vaughn is a critical part of the work that's happening in Jackson and across Mississippi, not only in response to COVID-19, but in terms of the need for racial reconciliation in our country and in Mississippi. Vaughn, thanks for stopping by on your day off.
Thank you for the invitation. Really glad to be here. Beth, it's great to see you.
Yeah, same here. So let me just start with a question to both of you, and maybe Beth, you can start with this. The challenges that we face, and we felt this in the questionnaire responses, as much hope as there was also a sense that these can be really overwhelming. And there's so much coming at people so quickly, all at once. And so I'm wondering, in your community, what are some of the first steps that you took to get your arms around this and to build a response that would be meaningful?
That's a good question. And that was, so Kentucky on March 5th is when we made our declaration of state of emergency. And quickly after that, the local health department rallied together a wraparound task force, and the Greater Clark Foundation was a part of that. And in those early months, it was really about tapping into everybody's anxieties, fears, really getting those on the table. It was understanding what were the most immediate emergent needs that we needed to focus on. And we really relied a lot on what was coming out from the CDC and the state, because there was quite a few things that were being told, you've got to deal with it at the local level. And we just kind of took that very literally and ran with it and focused on those first challenges for how do we keep people safe and stop a spread from coming here. The Greater Clark Foundation transitioned into helping facilitate this wraparound on behalf of the health department early on as well. So we've been doing that for about 5 months now. But I think that's what I would say would be our early stuff, just focusing on what is the first hard tasks to keep people safe.
And just a quick follow-up, just so folks know, the wraparound was 60 or so organizations, right, that you were meeting with twice a week. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes,
and
thank
how
you.
unusual that was for you.
Well, and the reason that we have that group, and we call it the Wraparound Task Force, is because that was one of the things the CDC said you're on your own with. You're on your own with the wraparound services to keep people fed, safe, getting medicine in their houses. You got to do it at the local level and take care of yourself. So that was the first thing we took literally, and we formed that group. And then after that, we just built on those first early tasks and tapped into who in that group, what were the knowledge and the skills and the capabilities there that we could leverage to fill those early voids and gaps that we were having.
Great. And Vaughn, how about in Jackson? What were some of the first steps that started to emerge there?
I will tell you, one of the kind of things that people are used to hearing about Mississippi is that we've got a significant number of people who live really close to the poverty line. Jackson is no different. As we've taken to saying it now, we've got a lot of citizens who are essential workers. And so the first steps that we saw was just kind of closing the gaps and needs for those people. Just as Beth described, making sure that people were able to eat, making sure that our community leaders, our mayor, supervisors, and even those in the suburbs of the city were aware and seeing all of the needs. I have said at different points, I think we live sometimes in such segregated spaces, racial and otherwise, that it's not out of the ordinary for people not to see others. And one of the responsibilities we have as leaders is make folks visible. So the social media posts, the statements being issued with kind of shutdown announcements for a lot of people often included a paragraph encouraging others to make sure that they saw the people who may not have had a voice. And so that was really one of the first and most prevalent things to happen here. It feels a little blurry now, Rich, to be honest with you, because shortly after we started to really kind of collectively respond to the public health crisis,
mm-hmm.
George Floyd was killed, and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, so many other folks who and the memories of folks who had gone unnamed publicly started to emerge. And so we started a very similar process, I think, when it came to that. So I'll talk about that more later if the opportunity arises, but responding to the crisis by making sure people were seen, and of course, encouraging a stronger sense of community. Yeah. Like, now is not the time to go to the corner and hoard resources. Now is the time to figure out how we can build a stronger safety net.
So Beth, when you think about some of the actions that you're taking, what has given you a sense of hope that we have the capabilities to respond to some of these challenges?
I agree with Vaughn. There's a lot of blurriness in trying to remember these last 5 months and kind of how it all, flowed. But hope has really emerged in people continuing to show up. And we started this group twice a week for 4 straight months, 1.5 to 2 hours twice a week. And people continued to show up. They continued to be authentic about their fears and the challenges. And also the exceptional amount of volunteerism that really has kind of come out of this too, I think is a point of hope. Because not everybody on the call, we might have these calls where we're thinking through all of the challenges, and we're thinking not just about right now what's in our face, but we were also kind of poisoning everybody to think about medium term and long term challenges as well. Let's be ready for what's coming in the pipeline throughout all of 2020 into 2021. But we come up with these activities to support some of these gaps, and people would just come out of the woodworks to volunteer in the midst of being scared, in the midst of, should I wear a mask, should I not? Because we didn't have a mask mandate yet in Kentucky. And so I think that early hope and that early, people showed a lot of vulnerability. There was a lot of people sharing real stuff, and that created room for hope to grow, I think, in that transparency and vulnerability.
So, and Vaughn, you were saying that I think you usually talked about how people are showing up a little differently. Are you seeing that happen in Jackson, particularly as you dealt with, for instance, the race after George Floyd's murder? And I know there were discussions in Jackson. We're seeing, one of the themes that you both have talked about consistently, at least so far, is the vulnerability people are showing, their willingness to deal with anxieties and fears. What role did that play as you all move forward?
Well, it's unfortunate, but it's timely. Very few things I think have the power, the impact of a public health crisis to make people feel vulnerable. Most rooms that I walk into, I'm almost 6 feet. I won't go down. Almost 6 feet and 225 pounds. I'm muscular. To most people who know me, I look like I'm in really good shape. But to be vulnerable, I've got a CPAP machine and I have hypertension. So, those are comorbidities according to Dr. Fauci and the team. So I walk into spaces aware that under these unique circumstances, I'm as vulnerable or more vulnerable than a lot of people I know. And I think that creates, just in me personally, a drive to bring the best of myself to the table to help us navigate and move beyond the challenge. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that is, I don't think I'm unique in that. Many of the people in our community approached it with the exact same insights. Mm-hmm. At a systems level, we've had conversations for a long time about the expansion of healthcare access in the state or the closure of hospitals in some of our rural communities. So generally, I think for our public, there was awareness that, listen, there are some gaps here. Mm-hmm. And we would waste a lot of time and probably lives if we ignored that. So I think kind of having been, socially distant or quarantined produced a rawness, an openness to vulnerability, and just speaking more authentically, that I think allowed people to show up, not in voice conversations alone, but in their social media posts and how they, poured their hearts out there. And certainly in our professional spaces, which can sometimes be all about your hard skills, right, and the soft stuff is ignored.
Yeah, well, I want to pick up on this notion of space, because I think, as you both know well, and as you just said, Vaughn, it's the exception rather than the rule when we show up in normal times, vulnerable, willing to reveal our anxieties and deeper fears. That's happening now more and more. This is sort of a two-part question. One is, what's the nature of spaces that you've had to create or that you've seen created that enable people to step forward and show up differently? And moving forward, as this blur maybe continues or recedes, how are we going to maintain these spaces moving forward?
Wow, Beth, I'm happy to jump to that one first. I know it's not fun to get all the questions first, so I'll go. We had an interesting experience at the Winter Institute as an organization. We're a really small staff of people. When the protest first began around the death of George Floyd, as an organization, we decided to host what in our work are called caucuses, where people of one racial identity get to kind of have an open forum. Well, it's a closed forum with other people who share that identity and express their thoughts and feelings. So we did that for a group of African American Mississippians, and actually a few people from outside of Mississippi joined. And we also did it for those who identify as white, or whose society identifies as white. That's not something we normally do.
Mm.
There's lots of thought and scholarship even about the value in doing it, but we recognize that it would have value. I was not on the white call, right, for obvious reasons. But based on the feedback I got from my colleagues, it was a really robust conversation. And for many, it was cathartic. The call I participated in, it was the same. Mm-hmm. And several of the common themes emerging out of both was this desire to not move beyond this moment alone, but for it to be a transformational moment. Mm-hmm. And that is a shared interest, shared value. That was one of the specific things that happened that I was involved in, but we saw faith leaders come together around the public health crisis and the systemic racism crisis in our community. Of course, getting to see our governor, who's newly elected as governor, with our state health leaders and emergency management leaders sitting at a table every day, having to take questions where many people in public have access to data. Mm-hmm. And be challenged to respond. Mm-hmm. That was a new thing. So I'm going to count that as one of those spaces, right, that the Lord above created, that right, I think has been encouraging for many in many ways, perhaps revealing in some others, yeah, but beneficial to the community for sure.
It's interesting, Vaughn. One of a number of things I take from your comments on this is how intentional the Winter Institute, the William Winter Institute, was in creating these spaces. How I think you said you had not created spaces like this before. Mm-hmm. So this was something different. So you were willing not only to create space, but to try something different that met the time that we're in, the demands that we're in. Mm-hmm. And I think, Beth, as I understand some things that have happened in Clark County, Kentucky, where you are with these 60 groups or however many are coming together twice a week, and is that this also is a different kind of space that you've created. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the nature of the space that got created there and why you think the space worked now as opposed to maybe some other time.
Well, and I echo your comment about Vaughn, that intentionality of that, what you all did sounds really cool. I think we've created space in the format and the way we've set up these 2 meetings twice a week. Mm-hmm. One, they both have 2 different themes and purposes. One of them in a week is about general report outs, data, as you alluded to, Vaughn. We got to look at data and track these indicators of what's going on in the community. But the other one was always about space for generative dialogue, where we brought up themes and topics that were timely to what was happening right now, either in the nation, in Kentucky, in our own community. And we had very real conversations about that it's okay to have deep emotions such as rage or fear or anger right now. And it's okay. And we don't need to tell anybody that their feelings are not okay. Everyone's feelings are culturally appropriate for them. So I believe we created space there. And then we were very intentional. We were asked by a mental health provider on the group. She urged us to be vulnerable. She said, you have to show vulnerability or other people in your lives or your patients, clients are not going to. And then I think taking it a step further into like individual topics, like in areas that needed some much more intentionality to them, we formed some extra groups under that wraparound that were very specific, topic specific, that gave those people space that had shared aspirations around, like, let's say housing, for example. We believe all people have, rights to safe and affordable housing. All those people with that aspiration started also meeting once a week in addition to the wraparound. And that gave them the safety, that safe place to talk about what's really going on in Winchester and Clark County when it comes to housing. And we did that with like 6 or 7 other topics. And I think that space has enabled real action to move forward. And I think you had a second part, Rich, but you need to remind me of it. What was the second?
What's it going to take to maintain this space over time?
Well, I think we're building that as we go. My boss loves to say, you build the plane, as you fly it. And that's what we're doing. We're being really intentional about staying in the long game of, it gets to that last point of yours about a shared agreement and shared aspirations for post-COVID. We're keeping that in mind, and we're already in our generative dialogue asking those questions. And so I think we're going to sustain it because I think people are really thriving on this new relationships, this new way of talking and connecting and partnering, because they keep coming back. They've come back for 5 months, and we're just going to keep rolling with it. Why would we not? Because we think we're actually changing community conditions with this work right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. Go ahead, Vaughn.
I want to. First of all, every time I hear that Beth and her team managed to get 60 of anything, people, puppies, anything in a room, that's a lot. That's a lot to manage. That's a heavy emotional and logistical toll. So I just want to say kudos to you for that.
Thank you.
In the work that the community of people I work with, not just within our organization, but there are others, including the Harwood Institute, we do that. I think for those who joined us, it would be valuable to take note of. And I don't lift us up as experts in it, just that it's something we know has happened over the course of history and it works. To Beth's point about these humanizing spaces. In our work, we hold circles very dear, because when you're literally sitting in a circle, a real circle, not an oval, everyone in the circle can be seen, and there's a value in that. The second thing that plays out in our circles or in our work is we put a premium on stories. We began our process not with your vita or resume and title, but with the stories, some of the earliest, most important stories to you, because it is humanizing, because it allows people to see the facets of you beyond your overalls or your shirt and tie. And that's really, I think, in my own experience, is really significant. And it has been an asset all over the country, based on what I'm hearing and reading, for a lot of different
Mhm.
organizations, because many people have a story to tell
Right.
around the public health crisis.
Right.
And many folks have a story to tell that they don't always want to tell it in polite company,
Mhm.
but they have a story to tell about race and systemic oppression.
Mhm.
And so, people are tired of looking at their spouses or their best friends telling these stories. They really wanted to tell them for a long time to other folks. But something happens, I think, communally when those stories are told.
Mhm.
They humanize, they create a greater sense of empathy and shared empathy. But there's some power also in what they, where you don't find that empathy and that humanization, it sticks out more than it stuck out before. Rhetoric that is dehumanizing of other people in your community, the places that it's coming from sticks out more
Mhm.
because there's this shared emphasis or discovered value for that. So I just want to encourage people. I mean, even if you've got if your agenda is full of bullet points and the first half is all data sharing, make room for that, because I frankly believe it creates the container. One of the people in our Jackson group who I think said hello in the call earlier talked about a container
Mhm.
that we create through these
Right.
processes that allow us to hold all of that data
Right.
and allow us to hold possibility, by creating that space in that way. So I think in addition to all the great analysis we do,
Mhm.
we need to go back to the basics, right? A group of people sitting around a fire to stay warm.
Yeah. So before I ask you one last question, I'm going to say to the folks who are on the call with us that in a minute or two, we're going to start taking your questions. So if you can just type them into the chat box, um, my colleague Max will keep track of them and lift some up, and then we'll engage in that conversation. So for those who are listening in and part of this, I've been following the chat box as we've been going, but type in your questions and we will start to get to them. One quick point and then a question for you. It's really interesting because I think in many cases, both of you have talked about a number of tensions that we need to hold simultaneously, right? So one is, on the one hand, Beth, you talked about people coming in with a sense of rage and anxiety, anger. I would add to that sorrow. And at the same time, we want to talk about our aspirations for moving forward. We've talked about the need for data and institutional and systemic change. And on the other hand, both of you have talked really eloquently about the need to humanize everything that we're doing and not overwhelm, in fact, invite that. We've talked about the need to take near-term action, right? You both started off by talking about the near-term immediate needs that people face, the sense of urgency that's around that, and also playing long game
Mhm.
and being able to do both simultaneously, right? So I think those are all really critical things for us to be thinking about, among others, as we move forward. So it leads me to ask you this question, and then we'll open it up for questions. So quick response to this, if that's even possible. What fears do you have that this time that we're in will be like other times? You know, after 9/11, we all got together and sang patriotic songs. We had flags flying from our homes. There was this sense of renewed patriotism, in a sense, at least among many people. The president's approval ratings were upwards of 90% at the time. That came and went. There have been natural disasters that we've seen an outpouring of energy, and then that energy recedes. We're all familiar with those examples. We've seen shootings, mass shootings. I've been involved in Newtown, for instance, where there's a call for action. That call recedes after some weeks or months or maybe even a year. what are your fears about this moment, and whether or not we will have a repeat of previous moments, or that something different can happen here?
Beth, you want to go first there?
Well, we can maybe go back and forth and play off each other.
Because I was about to take a deep breath before my response, so go ahead.
Yeah. Well, Rich, I'm a mom of a 3-year-old. So my fear is that, we cannot, what will her life be like, is what I really am fearful of. It reminds me, I'm from, being from Kentucky, Wendell Berry, he's got a famous poem about the peace of wild things. And that fear grows in you for your life and your kid's life and all kids' life. And so that's where I'm at personally, is that great fear. I fear that, this really neat work and this new way of partners. We have Parks and Rec employees that are doing things they never thought was in their lane, right? Everybody's switching lanes and blending their work together, and it's amazing. And I fear that, what if that goes away? What if everybody just after this is over forgets about these new great relationships that they formed? And even, we've watched people really blossom in their showing their knowledge and skills that we didn't know they had, because maybe they didn't ever feel welcome to give their gifts, right, to the problem and to the community, to the challenge. And they're speaking up now. So I'm fearful we'll lose whatever we've done to create that space where those voices are coming out. I fear we will lose it.
And what gives you a sense of hope? I see Jen Algar is asking me to reframe the question from fear to hope, and Jen knows that I talk endlessly about hope, so I thought I would ask about fears this time for a minute. But Jen, just so you know, I hear you. Given those fears, and then Vaughn, I'll come to you. Given those fears, what gives you a sense of hope moving forward?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, for what
you don't
gives me
get
a
off
sense
that easy. You don't get off that easily.
Gotcha. I got it. I'm good. What gives me a sense of hope, though, is, so you alluded that we've worked with you, Winchester's been, and we've actually been working with Harwood for, I think, going on close to 5 years. A lot of the pre-work leading up to, we hosted a large public innovators lab. What gives me hope is that we experienced real change in the past 3 years. And we have people, just grassroots people. It's just ordinary, not throw that word just out of there, ordinary people that just didn't maybe have that right sense of agency or didn't feel empowered. And now they do, and they show up and they call things out that are unjust. So that's what gives me hope, is that we have moved far enough along where we're seeing motion. So if this pandemic had hit before Harwood, if this had hit in 2014, we'd be at a very different point than we are now, with already having a lot of this trust and relationships already established. So that's what gives me hope, Rich, is this new place we're at, and with our public innovators.
Right. And you can vouch that I did not ask you to say that, right?
He did not. No, this is all from my observations, and it's real. Yeah. Yeah, it's very real.
Yeah. And Vaughn, and just let me remind folks, if you have questions, put them in the chat box so that we can take them up in just a couple of minutes. But Vaughn, let me come to you, because I'm really interested. What fears do you have about this moment? And then we'll turn to your hopes.
So let me tell a quick story. As people are expressing their frustrations in the streets all over the country through protest, making their heart's pain visible, really dear friends of mine who don't share the same identities that I do reached out to me. And one of the first question was always, how you doing? Because they know the work I do, they know it's intensely personal for me. And the second question was, what can I do? Where can I start? And these are not the people who would normally call. They asked me in college, like, or when I started doing work with women, man, why you want to work on race? That's crazy. My response to those people in that moment was that I felt they needed to decide whether they believed that a more just and equitable and humanizing society expanded the proverbial pie or if it shrunk it. Because the friends that they have who may not be my friends tell them, man, a woman, if you get involved in all of this stuff, you're going to end up redistributing opportunity, and your children are going to end up with fewer opportunities than you have. What kind of father, what kind of mother does that make you? Like, outside of polite company, that's how people challenge us when we commit to ideas of equity. I want everybody to have this or that or the other, but I don't want my kids to be worse off than I am. So the first challenge I've issued to my friends was to kind of come to have a moment with themselves and decide whether they believed that through this more just, equitable, humanizing society, the pie would be expanded, or if they believed we risked shrinking it and simply continue to fight over the squabbles. And that was important because I think once that decision is made, a commitment, action steps are much easier to commit to. And they can do that in the privacy of their own homes. They don't have to do it where they fear embarrassment. They can do an analysis of their lives in that privacy. People need and deserve that. But the choice is a pretty simple one, in my opinion. So my fear is that people won't do that analysis. Our reverting back or failing to seize moments, I think has largely happened because we recognize that the system as it exists carries our vested interests. What we want for ourselves and our children are better protected by the status quo than what we hear people talking about as a potential future, right? So we fall back on, well, it may not be perfect, but I can count on them to protect what I have or protect me against my fears. I've, say this, especially to the young people I work with. I don't know very many people who wake up in the morning and just say, I think it's a damn good day to be a racist. Right? I think it's a really good day to be sexist today. No, as Dr. Ibram Kendi and many others have pointed out through the course of history, people perpetuate racist, sexist, oppressive ideas when their self-interest are tied to them. That means in order for us to deconstruct those systems, we have to be committed to recognizing where our interests lie and perhaps buying into a vision that by expanding, by coming together, working together, diversifying spaces and ideas, that we do in fact grow the pie. I think that is our choice. And if we don't do that analysis as individuals, we will be lulled back into, it won't even be lulled. I mean, you can look at some of the rhetoric we hear all over society. People say, hey, look, you got it pretty good right now.
Yeah.
It's not perfect, but if you go the way of whatever, you risk losing that. And shame on you if your children inherit less than you inherit. So my message to my friends was not based on my hope, it was based on my fear. Because as I've said in different spaces, Rich, I do this for my survival. Like, I engage with people around race and difference because I never know if the policeman who pulls me over has been in a welcome table that I've been a part of, right? And he goes, you know what, man? I was talking to one of my colleagues about that story circle we had, right? I need that to happen. I need that to happen.
Yeah.
So that is what my fear is rooted in. My fear is that we won't seize that.
Yeah. So Max, I'm going to ask you to pull a question in just a second, but I just want to underscore something, Vaughn, that I think you're saying that's really critical for those of us who do this work. And Beth, I think you've said this in your own way as well, which is, with all the calls for systemic change, which are necessary, there is a need for a human change as well. Right? There's a need, as you suggested, for us essentially to look in the mirror, to spend a moment by ourselves, to reflect on ourselves, to reflect on our own behaviors, to reflect on our own assumptions, to reflect on where our interests intersect with others, that we need to do as individuals and as families. That cannot be replaced. It doesn't take the place of larger systemic change, but nor can it be replaced by larger systemic change. And sometimes I fear that all our talk about institutional change, which is really critical, so I just want to be clear about that, will overshadow the types of things that both of you have talked about in terms of vulnerability, of showing up differently, of humanizing things, of being real in the world. And so I appreciate your comments on that. Max, we have a question?
Yes, we do. Thank you very much, Rich, and thank you very much, Vaughn and Beth, for this fantastic conversation thus far. I want to start off this Q&A with something that more than one attendee has expressed interest in, and that's point number 4 on our main findings, that communities are working in new ways that demonstrate our innate capacities to get things done. It seems that several folks are wondering, Rich, if you could go into a little more detail about what exactly we're seeing. And for the sake of conversation, maybe you can talk a little bit about how, for those of us who aren't seeing as much of that in our spaces or communities, or feel that there needs to be more of that, what are some things that we might be able to take away from the places where people are saying that this is happening?
Sure. Do one of you want to jump in on that and talk about where you're seeing? Beth, you started talking some about people. I think you talked about people jumping into other lanes.
Sure. Yeah.
And working together differently.
Yeah, I can share some real examples of how we've seen people working together differently. You know, very early on, we had spring break hit, virtual spring break hit pretty early in those 5 months. And our school system needed a rest. They needed off that week. They were so exhausted from going virtual. I think they've been going virtual about 4 or 5 weeks. And we needed to feed kids breakfast and lunch and backpacks for a week. And that equated to about 1,000 meals at 7 different locations. So we mobilized a bunch of different sectors and our partners and then volunteers. Each of us kind of took a piece of it and figured out how to fund it, how to volunteer it, how to, when you show up when, all the logistics, and we fed all those kids. And so that 1 week has now evolved into an entire program called the Summer Involvement Program, because that one void of spring break became a larger void that we realized, oh my gosh, school's out all summer. So we haven't put eyes on kids, which means mandatory reporters haven't seen kids for a very long time for abuse and neglect. We've got to put our eyes on our kids and our families. And so that spring break group evolved into a huge effort where they have twice a week since May, going through the end of August, have a drive-through line to see kids, give them food, treats, activities, just have conversation with the adults. We found that the adults like it too, for that conversation. And we're up to 700 families that come through twice a week. So that's one example of how it just started out to fill one void, and it's evolved into a huge program that we actually see lasting beyond the pandemic and beyond the summer. Go
ahead, sorry.
No, you go. The other cool one I just love to talk about the homeless and housing group. Something we realized early on that I don't know if a lot of people talked about was when you shut down businesses and shut down your economy, you cut off your outdoor homeless people's access to water and sanitation and going to the bathroom and showering in a sink. And that's their dignity, and it's allowed. And you take it away in an instant. And we had to come to terms with that and say, this is not right. We don't believe in that. And so we managed to pull together different partners from emergency preparedness, Parks and Rec, the Greater Clark Foundation, and we found the trusted partner. Like, where do all the homeless go? Who do they trust? And they trust one person, one agency in the community. Well, let's say two, but they really go to one for most of their needs. We put an outdoor shower in their parking lot. We put an outdoor bathroom in their parking lot, and we put hand washing stations in their parking lot. And they stayed for quite a while. The hand washing is still there to this day, because we're telling everybody, wash your hands, stay clean. But we removed that for one very vulnerable group of people. So that was a really cool way that we came to. Different people paid for it all. You know, the cost was just spread out. Nobody complained about that, and it worked really well. And we also quickly, in the housing community, in our community, not everybody worked together, but maybe not well all the time, and sharing of resources and thoughts and brain power. And they now come together and they're sharing how they created isolation and quarantine plans. I mean, we have 2 homeless shelters that we had to make the goal of 0 cases. We're not going to let COVID in our homeless shelters. And they quickly came up with all the plans to do this. It took a lot of partners and a lot of meetings, weekend meetings, to get this one done, but it happened. Knock on wood. I hate it when I say that, because we still are at 0 in our homeless population. But those are 2 examples. I'll keep thinking too after Vaughn talks.
Vaughn, do you have an example how people come together in new ways?
First, I just want to shout out Beth for the great example she lifted up. To be honest with you, Rich, there are some examples, but there are some consistent principles that, if you'll permit me, I'd much rather share. We talked a little bit about vulnerability and humanizing in the beginning. Creating spaces, even Zoom calls, like fix your lunch and sit, like schedule a Zoom call with people who you think you may have some shared interest in organizationally, leaders, even frontline workers in those organizations, and have start a conversation. I mean, I think we're overthinking some of this. Mm-hmm. Think about how we build relationships, how we met our spouses or partners, how we connected with our best friend. I think there's some a young man named Anthony Johnson from Nashville was the first person to kind of share this with me. And he talked about the nexus between collaboration and trust. Like there are acquaintances, and then there are the people you're almost married to. The common theme, the thing that increases as the closeness of those relationships increase, is the trust. And so to get from there to the next place, the place of real collaboration, create a space where you can build trust. As I said earlier, I think the stories that our lives are made up of are some of the best ways to share. Because when you tell an honest story, people can see it, and it's easier for them to follow suit. And if you tell a story that's full of lies, people can tend to sense that as well. So trust that relationship building process, and create spaces based on that.
Right. So again, it's interesting in both your stories, the at the Institute, we have this saying, how we do the work is as important as what we do.
Yes. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
How we do the work is as important as what we do. And, there are lots of things that we could do that might look the same as things in the past.
Right.
But what might be appreciably different now and moving forward is the ways in which we created those spaces, the ways in which we had the conversations, the space, Beth, that we made for the rage or the sorrow or the pain that people feel, the humanizing of those spaces. And so I think as Americans, we often get fixated on the what. What's the answer?
Yep.
What's the answer? And I think right now we need to spend as much time thinking about how is it that we're going to come together that produces a different dynamic, different levels of trust, different relationships, different norms that enable us to move forward. And Beth, your example, that now has spun off, right, started as a thing about spring break, and now has spun off into multiple other things. So important.
Rich, there's one other thing that people can do what they've always done, with one exception, and I guarantee you it'll change the outcome. I would not be a youth engagement manager worth my salt if I didn't mention this. Marshall Gans is quoted, and he contributes this to several other folks. Marshall Gans is a community organizer. He thinks and talks a lot about it. He talks about young people having a critical eye and a hopeful heart, which is an interesting combination, right? You can see the faults, but you are hopeful still. Do what you've been doing. Just invite more than one young person into the space and watch how things turn out differently. Don't invite them to sit in the corner and bring everyone cups of ice. Invite them to the space and make room for their voice. Allow them to answer a question or two first.
Mm-hmm.
Allow them to lead. Show them the agenda and ask, what would you add? Right? For anyone with children over 5 and sometimes under 5, they'll hurt your feelings. They can be really, really honest with you, but you don't question their love or care for you. When you bring a group of adults into a room, most of the time, the first thing you really want to establish is whether or not they love and care for you. Mm-hmm. Right? So, our youth are depending on us to do better so that they can thrive. So they're vested. So invite them into the spaces. I mean, they don't have to be served by your organization necessarily. Mm-hmm. Invite that perspective in, and it will change things. I guarantee you.
I love that. I love that suggestion. I'm going to take that to heart and take that back to our community.
Might have to learn TikTok. You might have to TikTok.
Oh, no.
It'll work.
I did have one other comment too about stories, about storytelling. I think a tension that we've identified very recently with the concept of, just talking and telling your story with somebody. The context of our relationships between our patients and clients is changed so dramatically. And we really have a lot of partners that are struggling with that right now, where they can't sit down in a room and talk for 10 minutes and just tell each other their story of how their day's going or how their life is going. Because that's really where they get at the heart of really what's going on, and why are they here for their services. And that piece right now is missing. And so we've just now really honed in on that as a tension and a challenge. And we're trying to work on that very thing right now. We don't have the answer yet, but I think identifying it is the first step for sure. But I love the storytelling ideas. Thank you.
Great. Max, you got another question?
Yes, I do. So this has been sort of touched upon all throughout this conversation, but just to make it really explicit, I want to bring up something one attendee asked, which is considering how many folks are just trying to survive right now amid everything going on. This goes back to our conversation about fears and hopes. How do you engage people on their aspirations for themselves and their communities, which can be sort of a broad conversation when people are so focused on just survival and making it day to day, especially right now?
Great, thanks.
So I have a thought there. There's an exercise that our community building folks who work exclusively with adults in spaces like to do. And Richard, I'm sure y'all probably got 7 different versions of this at the Harwood Institute. But they're called asset maps, and they take on many different, looks. But you're basically looking at your community from different perspectives to kind of assess what tools you have. Like, let's just put every asset we have on the table, and then we'll figure out how we can use them. But, I've got a garage, and I've got tools, and I forget I have. Like, I'll go buy another set of screwdrivers. My wife's like, you got one last Christmas, it's not open. Sometimes we lose sight of what we have. This is a way I think that speaks to hope. Some folks experience, they felt always marginalized. They feel like they've never been fully listened to. They've never felt empowered. Hope, though they may have it intrinsically, it's a more difficult thing to articulate for people who share that type of experience. If you want to get me talking about race, I guarantee you there are people on this call who can be a whole lot more hopeful about it than I can, just based on kind of the limitations created by my experience. That being said, when I think about the assets that we have, the tools that we have, even if it's not the sharpest knife, it's a knife, then it helps me imagine ways of using it. Like, I know how to use a knife, but I'm not always sure I have one. And there's some people who have knives and don't know how to use them. So, I mean, it may seem a little counterintuitive, but have some conversations about where your assets are relative to your problem. Like, do an analysis of that. And I'm pretty confident that the conversation around it is going to move to, okay, what can we do? As Frank Figures, who's a civil rights veteran and a hero of mine, says in many spaces with young people, do what you can with what you have from where you are. See what you have and follow suit. And I think that will yield a hopeful conversation, or at least a conversation where people are able to identify the language to use around hope.
I agree with everything, with what you've said, Vaughn, for sure. I also think, we're wrestling kind of with this same topic right now. It's very timely, about the concept of hope and resiliency, because I personally think resiliency assumes a level of hope is already present, right? That we're going to get to the other side. We're going to get there, and we're going to be resilient. Well, what if I'm somebody that doesn't have that hope? I'm not in that. I'm in this day-to-day struggle. And so we're wrestling with that right now. And we think that a conversation about what are the community protective factors that we can build and wrap around everybody, even in that absence of hope, and maybe they don't even know that we're doing it for them, right? But we're building these community protective factors, just like we do in intense family therapy or with children. We talk about what are the protective factors for building a healthy family or for healthy parenting. We think we can translate that to the community too and help build hope. So more to come on that, but that's kind of where we're at too.
One quick thought on this, just to add to the points that you've already made. Is that in our work, where we've worked in communities that have been traumatized, which are most of the communities we've worked in, there has often been a need to allow the conversation to start with people's rage, their anger, their sorrow, to tell stories about that, to speak from their lived experiences, and then to pivot at that point to their aspirations for their community. Mm-hmm. Because most people at some point want to talk about where they want to go, what they want to create. Yeah. And then I think, Vaughn, it connects very much to this point of what do we have that we can start to use to start to move, to get in motion to do this. And I think one of the challenges that we face right now is we can stay for too long in the sorrow and rage, in the sense that it doesn't give anyone a sense of possibility. But I think equally, we can short circuit that and not have the courage and humility to stand in that space to hear it and experience it, which would essentially deny someone their reality, which ultimately denies them their dignity, in which case the game's over. So that's just to add to I think the great points you were mentioning. We've got time for one more question, some quick responses, and then I need to tie it up. So Max, you have a quick question?
I think so, yeah. So I'm going to take something that someone submitted, tweak it just a touch to sort of trigger some conversation. So what role, I mean, in the grand scheme of things, does leadership development play when we're thinking about pathways toward the future, both in the short term and long term?
Okay, let me see if I can get a quick 1-minute response from each of you on this.
I'll go first. Bring some young people in the room. That's leadership development. Bring some young people in the room with the older folks, and that too will be leadership development. To me, leadership development is just learning and becoming aware of what you don't know or skills you don't have. That's like foundational. Before you can build on something, you've got to know what your foundation is. And so look at learning, look at the developing relationships as a core component of leadership development in this moment. Now I just don't think it's the time for a 6-week seminar with leadership in the title. I think we need to all be out doing the best we can and in learning as we go, like with a mindset on learning, not, oh, I've got these tools and I'm going to go in and I'm going to use the hell out of them to get something done. No, go in with a disposition where you're curious and you're looking for new ways to engage and new ways to be effective. That's leadership development. And I don't mean any disrespect to that question, but I think, difficult times call for unusual thinking.
Yeah. One of the things I love, though, in your response, Vaughn, is this, what you called this disposition for learning, if I heard you correctly.
Yes.
Which is it's a beautiful phrase. And it again asks us to open ourselves up and to see and hear and be present and awake, not just barrel ahead. Right? Beth?
I love that thought, off of Vaughn's response, because so many times we don't take that pause, right, to think and really reflect on our own fears or biases and insecurities that are playing into how we are showing up as leaders. And so when I think about leadership development in the midst of this pandemic, I think definitely the youth, because they are so impacted by this right now. This is such a scary time for our youth, and this prolonged uncertainty. It's just this muscle of endurance for this long episodes. None of us, not a lot of us have. So I love the idea of working with our youth. And then I always think, when I think about leadership development, I think the answers are already in the community. It's not these best practices that are out there and researched and it worked in this big city and I'm in this, bedroom community that's half rural, it might not work. But somebody's already probably doing something that's positive and in a leadership role. It's just about finding those people. So I even think, we've had, years right now of Harwood experience and working and guidance. And if you haven't, I think my advice would be, you've got these pockets of action happening. You just got to go out and find these grassroots leaders and learn from them in Vaughn's spirit of learning. Talk to them, get to know them, learn who their friends are and their partners, and become an ally with them. And that's part of the leadership development that I think we have the opportunity to have right now.
That's great. So before I thank you, let me just tie a couple of things together. And so Max, if you can throw up, I just want to talk quickly because we're closing in on 2:30 Eastern time. I just want to raise 3 or 4 implications that I think are important that I just want to emphasize moving forward, that I hope echo things, Vaughn, that you said, and Beth, that you said, the wisdom that you brought and the insights that you brought to this conversation. One is that, I think, and these are all things that the Institute's going to be moving on as we move forward, is creating this conversation that you both talked about. We can't miss the need to talk to one another and to engage with one another, to see and hear one another. And from the Institute's point of view, that ultimately that conversation is going to have to be rooted in our shared aspirations about what we want to co-create together to build stronger communities and a more hopeful, inclusive, equitable, and fair society. That it can't be rooted in problems, it can't be rooted in utopian visions, but that shared aspirations that come from people's guts, and we need to change the frame of conversation in our country and in our communities. And as both of you have eloquently said, and as we've seen in all our work over the last 30 years, change has always been hinged on the ability to reframe what we have to think about and work on together. Second, that what we're calling a culture of shared responsibility, which is to tap into our innate capabilities, to not contract out this work that we need to do in society to other people, that we are co-creators in the world, co-creators of building our communities together, co-producers, if you want to use that phrase, partners, whatever phrase you'd like to use. And that, as both of you have given examples of and talked about, we need to create a culture of shared responsibility where we are in it together, and where, as you both said in different ways, where that requires both institutional actions and data, together with human scale actions in humanizing the world around us. And that too often we do not place value and worth in human scale actions. We only place worth in institutional actions, and many of the institutional actions are off base to begin with anyway, because they're imposed on communities and it's a one size fits all and those types of things. Third, that we've got to build broad-based public will for sustainable change. None of us, I think, on this call want this to be one of these moments that recedes as we've seen in the past. There's too much pain. There's been too much suffering. There is too much that we need to do in this country to do better in fulfilling the promise of America that is an ideal, but we're far from, and that we need to be awake to, attuned to, and that's not going to simply happen because we wish it. We need to build the public will for it, and that needs to be an intentional act. And then lastly, things that you both talked about in terms of storytelling, I just want to underscore. Many of the things that are happening in our communities many of the people are invisible to us, and many of the positive things that are happening are invisible to us, and many of the assets that we have are invisible to us. And I think we've got to double down on a commitment or make a new commitment to telling a new can-do narrative that makes the invisible visible. That makes people who are invisible visible to us. That makes the positive things, the productive things in ways in which people are coming together visible to us. That helps people see their lived experiences in the ways in which, Beth, to your point about resilience and people coming together sort of to build that in a hopeful way, visible. And right now we are stuck in an ingrained negative narrative that tells us all the things we're not capable of, all the things we can't do, all the things we won't do. And we've got to begin to lift up those things that we are doing to give ourselves a greater sense of possibility and hope, and create more momentum and generate some energy moving forward. So I just wanted to talk about those four implications. And then if I just go to the next slide, there are some things that the Institute's doing that I'd be remiss if I didn't mention. As many of you know, we've had a campaign called Stepping Forward before COVID hit. We did, this is based on a new book I wrote called Stepping Forward. We did 20 stops in about 3 months in last year. We're homebound now, we can't do stops, but we can engage virtually. And the Institute's had great success in framing and generating conversations in virtual spaces. And so we've decided to take the Stepping Forward campaign virtually to regional roundtables and to local roundtables to both make the case, but also engage people in how we can come together and have the conversations we need to have, and to begin to spark greater sense of hope moving forward. So if you're interested in that, go to steppingforwardcampaign.org. drop us a note. We'd love to engage with you. We have a fall 2020 virtual lab coming up. It starts October 8th. You can sign up online for that. I promise, Vaughn, it won't be the typical 6 leadership sessions that you mentioned. I heard you loud and clear. I'm with you. Virtual lab, we just had the largest group go through the virtual lab in the spring. There's this guy named Rich Harwood. As I said, he wrote this new book called Stepping Forward. You can get it at Amazon. Get a copy, share it with your friends, write about it. I think it's more relevant now than when I wrote it because it talks about an alternative vision for how we can move forward in practical ways to build a more hopeful, inclusive society. You'll be getting an evaluation of this. We hope you will fill it out. We take these seriously. Vaughn just participated in an entirely redesigned lab in Mississippi based on a lot of feedback we've gotten. So we're a learning organization. We take this stuff seriously. And then lastly, go to our website and you'll see some resources there. Max, if you can pull this slide down, we'll also be sending you this slide so you'll have that. But most importantly, what I want to do is to thank our 2 guests. Beth Jones, who is doing, because I'm a witness to it, amazing work in Winchester and Clark County. It's just great to see what you're doing. It's great to have you here today. We really benefited from your insights and experience and wisdom. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rich, for inviting me. Thank you very much.
And
it's an honor.
Yeah, it's an honor for you to be with us. And Vaughn Gordon, who has dedicated his life to dealing with these tough issues when you could have done something much easier, much simpler, probably made more money. But you have, I know, committed yourself to this because you know it's important, because I know as Beth has a daughter, you have 3 daughters, yes, and you're looking to their future. And I want to thank you for your leadership in Mississippi and around the country for all the work you're doing. So, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Rich, may I take 10 seconds to make one point? In seeing some of the comments, there have been a lot of questions about systemic change. Mm-hmm. If our work has taught us nothing else, it's that systems don't change if people don't. Systems mm-hmm. are created, maintained, and administered by people. There must be transformation at the personal level before we can get change at the systemic level. So you may as well get comfortable engaging with the people who are administering the systems and writing the policy. And if those people aren't living out what you had on the slide before the last, then they shouldn't be in the position of leadership.
Yeah, agreed. Amen. Amen. So let's get to work. Let's remember how we do the work is as important as what we do. Let's remember that this is not a moment. This is an opportunity to seize for transformational change in our country. And let us not forget that while America was founded on original sins, we have an opportunity to make a more perfect union, and that requires all of us pulling in common cause with common purpose in a common direction. So let's get to work and let's get on with it. So thanks for everyone for joining us.